If you say to a British person, what sort of topical world issue, geopolitical issue, winds them up the most, the average British person is probably likely to say something connected with Europe, the EU. This is a very emotive issue for British people, and it has been ever since we joined in 1973. We joined that year with Ireland and I believe Denmark. Um, so that makes us somewhere in the middle of joining, actually slightly earlier than quite a lot of countries. We weren't one of the original Benelux countries to set up the European Union, but we did join under the premiership of Edward Heath. And ever since then it's been a deeply controversial issue. Now, I'm saying this, by the way, in the context of a state visit by Angela Merkel. She's only the second German Chancellor since Willy Brandt in 1970 to address the British Parliament, so it's a pretty significant visit. This has got a lot more attention than when President Hollande of France visited last month, because his visit was overshadowed by his personal scandals. But this is also significant because Merkel is generally regarded as the most powerful politician in Europe, so her stance on any given issue is going to be very significant. I've just watched a bit of the speech. She spoke in English, and she took a somewhat neutral tone, whereby she said that for those wanting to see a complete sort of reform of Europe's fundamental institutions, they're going to be disappointed with what she had to say. But people also saying that, basically, to put it in another way, they want to see, they don't mind seeing Britain leave. They would also be disappointed. So what Merkel is essentially seeming to be saying is that she wants Britain to stay, but she can't give us exactly what we want. Now, I have to say, broadly speaking, I've always been a pro-European, and I do call myself a European person. For 1 minute, let's just leave aside the EU as an institution and talk solely about Europe, the continent, culture, and so on. Many British people will never describe themselves as a European. You even get people who barely describe themselves as British, they're English, and that sort of mentality. But I think to pretend that we have no connection with Europe is profoundly ignorant. British history has been hugely influenced by mainland Europe. Whether it be the Romans and the 400 years that they were here, then we have the Norse invasions, the Saxon conquest, which in many ways is more important than the Norman conquest. All of those things defined our history for a millennium. So the idea that we have no cultural connection to the rest of Europe is just beyond ridiculous. And then there's the countless conflicts and peace agreements and statutes, etc., etc., that we've been involved in over the centuries. British history is interchangeable with European history. That's a matter of fact, and you can't deny it. So it does annoy me when some of my fellow Britons pretend that we have no connection to Europe, and they talk about Europe like it's some far off place. Now, it is true that we are an island nation, and there's always going to be that island nation mentality. You can see this in other parts of the world. You can see it in Japan. There's a certain isolated attitude in Japan to the rest of Asia, and I'm sure you could find other examples. But that doesn't change the fact that Britain is interchangeable with European history. It's simply a fact. So I am a European. I call myself a European, and I'm proud to do so. I'm not dictating to other British people what they should say, but I am saying that if they deny that we have a connection with Europe culturally, it's just stupid. Of course there's unique British things that you can only find in this country, culturally speaking, and that's fine. But to pretend that we have no cultural connection with Europe is simply to deny history, and I really take issue with that. So that's Europe, the continent. Now, to the EU as an institution. firstly, there's the situation in Ukraine right now shows just how important this issue is to some people, and it can literally be a life and death situation. The streets of Kiev are soaked in blood over this issue. So this is not a static issue, it's something that is very live wire, and definitely not a trivial issue. I mean, as we've seen in Ukraine, people are prepared to die for the European ideal. And it's very sobering to think that. I also think that when we go back to the foundations of the European Union, at that time it was the European Economic Community, and it started off as a mining agreement, I believe in the Alsace-Lorraine region. It was economic, but it was also based on the philosophy that Europe is a continent that had been drenched in blood for hundreds and hundreds of years. Pretty much every European country has at some point been at war with another European country. This is a continent drenched in blood. So the European ideal of creating a situation that it would be inconceivable for nation states to go to war with each other was a very, very important ideal. It always will be. That's why, to this day, it's incomprehensible, no matter how heated debates may get, it's incomprehensible for Britain or France or Germany to declare war on one another. Compare that to East Asia, where there isn't a similar sort of, there is ASEAN, but that's nowhere near as strong as the European Union. Compare that to East Asia, where you have a situation where open threats of war are frequently spoken about, between China and Japan, between Japan, South Korea, etc., China and the Philippines. Even if there won't be an actual war, the very fact that they talk about war shows just how strong neo-nationalism is in those countries. Now, nationalism certainly exists in Europe as well, but the framework of the EU is such that it's a rather genius system whereby countries rely on each other so much that to attack one another in an act of war would be self-destructive. And this is part of the genius of the European Union. So I do strongly believe in that principle of the European dream. However, in recent years I've been looking more at the other side, i.e. Eurosceptic, and Britain is, let's face it, a Eurosceptic country. I'd say 70% of people are Eurosceptic in this country, broadly speaking. Okay, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are roughly pro-Europe, the Tories are roughly anti-Europe, but even every Tory Prime Minister has never went as far as to say he or she wants Britain to exit the EU. Cameron's probably went further than anyone, but he's never been on record saying he wants Britain to leave the EU. And there's domestic politics involved in this. Cameron knows that a lot of his core supporters would love a referendum in the EU, which he has promised for 2017. That's still 3 years away. Anyway, back to the point I was talking about. In recent years I have become more understanding of the other side. And I do think there's some problems in this debate. It does seem to me that when Eurosceptics question Brussels, and in Britain the most prominent Eurosceptics are a party called UKIP. Now, I'm not a member of UKIP, and I certainly don't like a lot of their philosophy. However, it is true that whenever Nigel Farage, he's the UKIP leader, speaks in Brussels, he's shouted down. Now, how can you have a democracy that works like that, whereby people critical of something are simply shouted down? The EU is, broadly speaking, a democracy, but there's also immense arrogance in Brussels. And Farage is right about one thing. It is rather absurd that you have nameless bureaucrats, well, not nameless, but these guys who have very little public profile, and yet they can make very influential decisions about life in European countries, not just in Britain, in other parts of Europe. So in other words, if someone is mugged in Leeds, or if, let's say, there's an abortion debate in Italy, or whatever, very often the decisions about that end up in Brussels. So there is a very legitimate concern here about national sovereignty and democracy, and that infuriates people. when decisions are made in Brussels, and I'm sure it infuriates a lot of domestic governments as well, especially in Britain. I'm sure the Tories would love to carry out their message of being tough on crime, but there's Brussels legislation that prevents them from doing that. Now, there's areas like that I do believe should be reformed, and it does frustrate me when Europhiles shout down anyone who disagrees with them as being far-right or neo-nationalists or even racists. It's a very weak argument to make, to vilify your opposition in that way. Now, there are those elements among Eurosceptics, of course there are, but questioning Europe is not a crime, especially when we're talking about issues of national sovereignty. And these are legitimate issues, and Britain isn't the only country to raise these issues. Britain is probably the most Eurosceptic of the big countries, but there's Euroscepticism in every country, including the supposedly most pro-EU countries like France and the Benelux countries, and Germany. There is Euroscepticism to be found within those countries, because it is a question about democracy in this. How can it be democratic when bureaucrats in Brussels decide justice in Britain? I believe there are serious questions to be made about that. Now, it's my understanding, and by the way, Europe is a very, very complex issue. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but it's my understanding that what David Cameron wants is a situation whereby we continue the free trade that is in Europe. That's a very good thing, and it has largely created the prosperity we see in Europe. This is the most prosperous region in the world, with the exception of North America. And as a single economy, it's actually a bigger economy than the United States. If the EU was one economy, it's the world's biggest economy. And in terms of stability, this is probably the most peaceful part of the world. These are things that can't be underestimated. So Europe's achievements are massive. We can't underestimate that. You know, a few years ago, the EU won the Nobel Prize for Peace, I believe. It was controversial at the time, and I can understand that. Nevertheless, we can't underestimate the achievements that Europe has made. But this is a bit like my immigration video. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I'm broadly speaking pro-EU, because the problem is, if we leave the EU, it would be a case of splendid isolation. This is no longer the 1850s when we have a very powerful empire to back us up. If we leave the EU, we leave the world's most powerful economic bloc. That would just be foolish. UKIP can make all the promises they want, but in the end of the day, leaving the EU would isolate us on the world stage. And that is definitely not an act of patriotism. It's just stupid. Having said that, I do think it's reasonable for nation states, sovereign nation states, to demand that there are reasonable reforms when British lives, or Czech lives, or Polish lives, or Danish lives are being impacted. Because on the ground, there is anger about the power that Brussels has. And the thing is, the whole point about the European leadership is it's meant to be somewhat obscure. I mean, the current president of the Commission, I believe, is Herman Van Rompuy. Well, there's several presidents. There's a Commission president, which I think is Barroso, and then Herman Van Rompuy is also one of the leading representatives of the EU. But he does not seem accountable to a lot of normal Europeans. You know, he doesn't. He addresses the European Parliament, but he never has to directly answer questions of European citizens. So, from that point of view, it's not that democratic. Now, it's true that people are elected to the European Parliament from every representative country. In that sense, it's a democratic system. But in terms of the power Brussels has versus how much say Europeans have, that's a very questionable situation. And I would argue it's legitimate for Europeans to ask that they have a lot more say in how Europe is run. Now, the German position is Britain can't treat the EU like a menu where it's part of this powerful economic bloc and we just take what we want and do what we want. I can understand that argument. Nevertheless, the United Kingdom is a sovereign state, and so is every other EU country. So as long as that is the situation, I think basic fundamental requests, that there's some democratic reforms, are entirely reasonable. I've come to the end of the bandwidth, so I'll leave it there. That's my thoughts on the EU.